Morning. You know why I pulled you over?
No, sir.
You crossed the line back there. Been drinking?
No, I have not.
Where are you headed?
To my lodging.
Step out of the vehicle. I'm detaining you.
I do not consent to any search.
Have you ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force of sheer arrogance collides with an immovable wall of constitutional expertise? We all navigate the world using mental shortcuts, but when those shortcuts are built on foundationless assumptions, deep-seated biases, and snap judgments, and when the person making those judgments carries a badge, the fallout can be extraordinarily destructive. True authority does not need to scream to be heard, and true power often lies in absolute, chilling silence. Today's narrative is a masterclass in emotional discipline, a profound lesson on why you should never judge a book by its cover, and a perfect example of how to let a bully meticulously construct their own downfall. Dawn had barely broken on a chilly midweek morning, casting long, pale shadows across the evergreen-lined corridors of a major eastern freeway. The asphalt was still slick with a thin layer of condensation, reflecting the headlights of the sparse early commuter traffic. Most of the vehicles navigating this stretch were heavy commercial transports, or locals, making their way to the sprawling regional military base situated a few dozen miles ahead. Gliding effortlessly within the right-hand lane was a meticulously clean, dark-tinted luxury rental sedan. Behind the wheel sat a man who radiated an aura of profound, unshakable discipline. He was middle-aged, sharply groomed, and maintained a posture so perfectly straight it seemed as though a steel rod ran down his spine. Dressed in unassuming civilian attire, a freshly ironed navy polo and perfectly tailored khaki trousers, he gave off the impression of a mid-level corporate executive heading toward a mundane financial conference. However, appearances are notoriously deceptive. This man was, in reality, a highly decorated senior commander and the chief legal counsel for a massive branch of the armed forces. He was essentially a supreme prosecutor, an individual whose entire career was built on an encyclopedic, devastating mastery of federal statutes, civil rights, and high-stakes tribunal litigation. He spent his professional life dismantling the careers of corrupt officials and untangling complex webs of deceit. But on this particular crisp morning, he was entirely off-duty, enjoying the solitude of his rented luxury vehicle. With his speed regulated flawlessly to the exact legal limit, his hands rested comfortably on the leather steering column at the classic 10 and 2 positions. He was deeply engrossed in a highly technical, hours-long audio lecture concerning recent appellate court decisions, perfectly content and entirely oblivious to the fact that he was about to become the focal point of a severely misguided fishing expedition. Concealed within the grassy median separating the highway lanes sat a seasoned patrolman inside a heavily equipped law enforcement cruiser. This officer considered himself an apex predator of the asphalt, a proactive enforcer who didn't merely wait for speeders but actively hunted for anything he deemed suspicious. Unfortunately, his definition of suspicious relied heavily on personal prejudice and flawed profiling rather than objective facts. As the sleek sedan drifted past his concealed vantage point, the patrolman's gaze snapped toward it. His mind immediately began connecting dots that did not exist. He noted the out-of-town registration plates attached to a high-end vehicle with darkened windows, and as it passed, he caught a fleeting glimpse of the driver's profile. In the patrolman's deeply biased mental framework, this specific combination was an undeniable indicator of criminal activity. Rather than seeing a citizen traveling peacefully, his misguided prejudice painted a picture of a courier transporting illicit substances or hidden currency. He lacked any genuine, legally justifiable reason to initiate a traffic stop, but in his mind, the end would justify the means. He knew precisely how to fabricate an excuse. Throwing his heavy cruiser into gear, the patrolman tore out of the median, his tires kicking up a storm of wet grass and dirt as he aggressively accelerated onto the pavement. He quickly closed the distance, positioning his vehicle mere feet from the sedan's rear bumper. This was a classic intimidation maneuver designed to induce panic. The goal was to frighten the motorist into checking their rearview mirror, getting startled, and instinctively jerking the wheel or slamming on the brakes, actions that would immediately justify a detention. The commander, however, did absolutely nothing of the sort. His heart rate remained perfectly steady. He registered the aggressive presence of the cruiser in his mirrors, maintained his exact velocity, and kept his sedan perfectly centered within the lane markers. Infuriated by the motorist's complete lack of a nervous reaction, the patrolman resorted to the most common, legally ambiguous tactic available, the phantom violation. He convinced himself that the sedan's rear tire had momentarily grazed the solid white boundary line on the shoulder of the road. It was an incredibly minor, essentially unprovable allegation, but it provided the necessary loophole to activate his emergency lights. He flipped the switch, instantly flooding the dim morning highway in blinding, aggressive bursts of red and blue. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the sedan, the commander let out a slow, measured breath. He did not utter a single curse word. He didn't scramble frantically to hide anything, nor did he nervously pat down his pockets. Having spent decades dominating courtrooms, he understood the mechanics of this encounter better than the man pulling him over. The commander smoothly engaged his turn signal, gently decelerated, and guided the heavy vehicle onto the wide gravel shoulder, bringing it to a flawless halt. With practiced, deliberate precision, he shifted the transmission into park and killed the ignition. To eliminate any perceived threats or blind spots, he lowered all 4 windows simultaneously, letting the crisp morning air flood the cabin. Finally, he placed his empty hands flat on the uppermost curve of the steering wheel, slipping into an absolute chilling silence as he waited for the interaction to begin. The heavy, metallic slam of the patrol cruiser's door echoed sharply through the quiet evergreen forest. The officer stepped onto the gravel, adjusting his equipment belt with a forced, aggressive swagger. As he approached the sedan, he reached out and firmly pressed his thumb against the rear taillight assembly, a routine procedural habit designed to leave forensic evidence of his presence in the event the situation escalated. He unclasped the safety retention strap on his sidearm, fully expecting to peer into the window and find a trembling, disorganized civilian frantically digging through a glove box. Instead, the scene he encountered completely derailed his predetermined narrative. The lowered windows eliminated any shadows, and the driver was sitting in absolute stillness. The commander's posture was rigid, his hands resting in plain sight. He did not swivel his neck to look up at the approaching authority figure. His gaze remained fixed securely on the distant horizon. It was a display of ultimate calculated compliance that, paradoxically, completely neutralized the patrolman's presumed dominance. "Good morning," the officer announced, his tone dripping with the forced, abrasive cheerfulness of someone actively seeking a confrontation. He leaned aggressively into the window frame, physically invading the sanctuary of the vehicle. Standard operational guidelines dictated that he should immediately identify himself, state his agency, and clearly articulate the reason for the detention. He skipped all of these mandates, diving straight into a psychological trap. "Do you have any idea why I decided to pull you over today?" "No, sir, I do not," the commander responded. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, devoid of any anxiety, devoid of forced respect, and completely lacking any desire to engage in casual banter. The patrolman's jaw clenched. The driver wasn't offering an unprompted apology or accidentally incriminating himself. "You were swerving back there," the officer lied effortlessly, resting his palm dangerously close to his holstered weapon. "Your tires crossed the boundary line. Are you feeling fatigued? Have you consumed any alcohol this morning?" "I have not consumed any alcohol," the commander stated plainly. He did not attempt to defend his driving abilities. He did not debate the fictitious boundary line violation. He provided a strictly literal response to the specific question posed, effectively starving the interrogation of any conversational oxygen. "Where exactly are you rushing off to?" the patrolman pressed, pivoting his tactics in an attempt to catch the driver off guard. "I am not rushing," the commander replied, his eyes still locked forward. "I am simply driving toward my lodging." The profound brevity of these responses began to genuinely enrage the patrolman. In his distorted worldview, any civilian who didn't display immediate fawning intimidation was clearly attempting to conceal a crime. He took a half-step backward, his voice hardening into a sharp demand. "I require your driving credentials and the paperwork for this vehicle immediately." "This is a leased vehicle," the commander articulated with rhythmic calmness. "The lease agreement is located inside the passenger compartment. My identification is securely inside my back right pocket. Which of these documents would you prefer I retrieve first?" The patrolman blinked, momentarily stunned. The driver was verbally telegraphing his physical movements, a highly advanced de-escalation technique specifically designed to prevent a nervous or trigger-happy officer from mistakenly believing a suspect was reaching for a weapon. The realization that this seemingly ordinary individual was flawlessly executing high-level tactical procedures irritated the officer to his very core. "Just hand over the identification," he snapped impatiently. Moving with exaggerated slowness, the commander removed one hand from the wheel, extracted his wallet, and produced the required card. As the officer snatched the plastic credential, he simultaneously unclipped a high-intensity tactical flashlight from his belt. Despite the sun rising higher in the sky, he clicked the blinding beam on and began aggressively sweeping it across the pristine interior of the sedan. He illuminated the floor mats, the empty passenger seat, and the center console, desperately hunting for any shred of probable cause, an empty bottle, a stray medication capsule, anything to justify his bias. Finding nothing in the front, the harsh beam sliced into the rear passenger area. Resting flat across the expensive leather upholstery was a lengthy, heavy-duty, opaque nylon bag, securely zipped from end to end. The patrolman paused, his eyes narrowed sharply. Through the distorted lens of his prejudiced mindset, a heavy, elongated bag in the back of a rental vehicle wasn't carrying formal wear. It was concealing a high-powered firearm. It was the exact, legally ambiguous loophole he desperately needed to tear the vehicle apart under the protective umbrella of officer safety. Clicking off his flashlight, the patrolman leaned back into the window frame, a dangerously smug grin spreading across his face. "What exactly do you have stashed in that long bag back there?" he demanded, purposely dropping any professional titles to establish a false sense of superiority. "Apparel," the commander answered evenly. "Apparel," the officer repeated, his tone thoroughly saturated in disbelief. He rapped his knuckles loudly against the roof of the sedan. "To me, that looks suspiciously like a carrier for a long rifle. We catch a lot of individuals smuggling illegal firearms along this route. I think it's best we make absolutely certain you aren't hauling anything dangerous today." For the first time since the lights flashed, the commander slowly pivoted his head. He locked eyes with the patrolman, delivering a stare so intensely analytical and heavy that it felt like a physical blow. The trap was now fully armed and waiting to be sprung. The patrolman's arrogant smirk practically begged for an emotional outburst. He was hoping the motorist would lose his temper, scream, or act erratically, providing the necessary legal cover to execute an arrest. But the commander did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. Instead, he erected an impenetrable constitutional fortress. "Sir," the commander articulated, every syllable ringing with crystalline clarity, "I am not transporting any firearms or illicit materials. Furthermore, I explicitly deny consent for any search of this vehicle or my personal belongings." The words hung suspended in the damp morning air. For a rogue enforcer accustomed to bullying terrified teenagers or panicked criminals, a calm, legally flawless refusal of consent was the equivalent of a physical strike to the jaw. The smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a deep flush of indignation. To an officer operating on ego, an educated citizen exercising their rights is viewed as the ultimate disrespect. "Oh, is that right?" the officer sneered, his hand dropping aggressively back onto the grip of his firearm. He leaned in so close his breath fogged the window pane. "Here is the reality of your situation. You are traveling with a heavy, opaque bag perfectly proportioned for a rifle. You are far from home in a heavily tinted car, acting extremely defensive. That combination grants me reasonable suspicion." It was an egregious, fictionalized distortion of the law, and the commander knew it instantly. An article of luggage inside a vehicle absolutely does not meet the legal threshold for reasonable suspicion of a criminal act. However, the commander also understood a fundamental truth. You do not debate constitutional law on the side of a lonely highway with an armed, irrational individual. You remain silent and you allow them to document their own catastrophic errors on camera. "I am completely tranquil," the commander replied, remaining perfectly statuesque, "and asserting my constitutional rights is not an act of defensiveness. It is the law." "Save your legal theories for a magistrate," the patrolman barked, his patience completely evaporating. He took a wide step backward and pointed a rigid, commanding finger at the driver. "I cannot verify the contents of that container, and I refuse to risk my life because you want to be difficult. For my personal security, you are now officially being detained. Unfasten your restraint with your left hand, utilize your right hand to open the door, and exit the vehicle immediately." Under established judicial precedent, law enforcement does possess the authority to order occupants out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. Knowing the jurisprudence flawlessly, the commander offered zero resistance. Moving with highly exaggerated, deliberate motions, he unlatched his belt, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the damp gravel. Even standing relaxed, the commander towered over the patrolman, his posture radiating the undeniable rigid discipline of a seasoned military leader. "Turn around, face your vehicle, and place your hands behind your back," the officer commanded harshly, violently ripping a set of metal restraints from his belt. The commander did not inquire if he was under arrest. He did not argue. He simply rotated smoothly, placed his wrists together behind his back, and intertwined his fingers. The patrolman grabbed the commander's arms with entirely unnecessary aggression, wrenching them forcefully upward before ratcheting the freezing steel tightly around his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed loudly. "You are being secured pending a protective sweep of the passenger compartment," the officer declared, conducting a rough, invasive pat-down of the commander's clothing. Discovering nothing but a mobile device and a set of lodging keys, the patrolman gripped the commander firmly by the arm and marched him directly to the front bumper of the police cruiser, positioning him dead center in the frame of the dashboard recording system. "Do not move a muscle," the officer ordered. The commander stood like a statue, the icy steel biting into his skin. He stared directly into the unblinking lens of the patrol vehicle's camera, his face a completely unreadable mask. He had just been unlawfully deprived of his liberty, based on a fabricated traffic infraction and a malicious misapplication of safety protocols. Spinning on his heels, the patrolman marched eagerly toward the open door of the sleek sedan. He firmly believed he was moments away from making a career-defining discovery. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to unzip an apocalyptic legal nightmare that would decimate his professional life. Standing bathed in the morning sunlight, the commander kept his eyes locked forward. He was a sworn officer of the court, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to defending the structural integrity of the legal system, and he was currently serving as the perfect bait for its blatant violation. Every second of his calm, non-threatening demeanor was being meticulously recorded. A few yards away, the patrolman was practically vibrating with adrenaline and unchecked authority. He breached the threshold of the rear passenger door. By entering that private space without a judicial warrant, without legitimate probable cause, and in direct defiance of the driver's explicit refusal, he had just committed an egregious violation of federal civil rights. He was risking everything on the fragile hope of finding a weapon to retroactively justify his reckless actions. Reaching across the pristine upholstery, the officer grabbed the heavy nylon bag. His thick fingers squeezed the material, fully anticipating the hard, unforgiving steel of a gun barrel. Instead, he met the soft, yielding resistance of layered fabric and a wooden hanger. A sudden, chilling wave of apprehension washed over the back of the officer's neck, but his monumental ego pushed him past the warning signs. Yanking the heavy zipper upward, he split the opaque bag wide open and aimed his tactical light inside. There was no weaponry, there was no smuggled currency. Hanging within the protective casing, pressed to absolute razor-sharp perfection, was a United States Armed Forces formal service tunic. The deep blue fabric was immaculate. The intricate gold braiding wrapped around the sleeves clearly denoted an incredibly high-ranking senior official. Pinned meticulously above the breast pocket was a staggering, heavy array of medals, commendations, and a combat service insignia. The patrolman's breath hitched in his throat. The flashlight in his trembling grip began to shake, causing the beam to dance frantically across the polished silver and brass hardware. His panicked eyes darted upward to the shoulder boards. Fastened securely to the fabric were two massive sterling silver eagles, a full bird colonel, an individual occupying a tremendously elevated echelon of military leadership. But it was the distinct insignia pinned perfectly to the lapels that caused the patrolman's stomach to plummet into a bottomless abyss. Gleaming under the harsh white light was a solid gold emblem, a crossed sword positioned over a feathered quill pen. Even a local county officer recognized the devastating weight of that specific symbol. It was the mark of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. The officer's brain catastrophically misfired as the sheer magnitude of his error crashed down upon him. The individual he had just profiled based on prejudice, unlawfully detained, aggressively manhandled, and publicly humiliated, wasn't a criminal. He was a sitting supreme military magistrate. He was a chief prosecuting authority who possessed a lethal encyclopedic comprehension of civil rights violations and constitutional law. And the officer had just handcuffed this man directly in front of an active recording device. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogant power trip instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating wave of cold, nauseating panic. His fabricated safety excuse was dead on arrival. He had illegally rummaged through the personal effects of a senior federal legal official. He had just waded into the exact type of federal civil rights deprivation that the Department of Justice ruthlessly prosecuted. With violently shaking hands, the officer managed to slowly zip the garment bag closed, terrified of even snagging the precious fabric. He backed away from the vehicle, gently pushing the passenger door shut, as if the metal handle were coated in high explosives. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned back toward his cruiser. The commander was still standing exactly where he had been placed, staring intensely into the camera lens. He hadn't shifted a single inch. He had already achieved total victory. The patrolman's heavy boots dragged against the gravel as he walked back. The inflated, aggressive swagger from minutes prior had entirely vanished, replaced by the hollow, trembling posture of a man approaching his own professional execution. Stopping a few feet away, he reached with trembling, clumsy fingers for the small metal key on his belt. He plastered a pathetic, desperately fearful smile onto his pale face, attempting to defuse the catastrophic explosive he had just detonated. "Look, sir," the officer stammered, his voice completely hollowed out of any prior authority. He took a hesitant half-step forward, displaying the tiny key. "It appears we just had a slight miscommunication here today. I checked the area and everything is perfectly fine. I'm just going to go ahead and remove these restraints, issue you a quick verbal warning for the lane violation, and get you back on your way." He reached out, desperately hoping to quietly undo the damage. "Do not lay a hand on these restraints," the commander ordered. He didn't scream. The volume of his rich baritone voice didn't rise a single decibel, but the absolute crushing authority radiating from his words caused the patrolman to freeze instantly, his hand hovering uselessly in the cold air. "You absolutely do not possess my permission to remove this hardware." the commander stated firmly, his piercing gaze locking onto the terrified officer, acutely aware that the microphone on the cruiser's dashboard was capturing every single syllable. You detained my person under a fabricated guise of security. You subsequently utilized that illegal detention to bypass my explicitly recorded denial of consent, conducting a warrantless invasion of my property. You are absolutely not going to sweep a severe deprivation of civil rights under the rug with a casual verbal warning. The patrolman swallowed audibly, his complexion turning a sickly, ashen gray. Sir, please, I beg of you. I was merely trying to do my job. I made a terrible misjudgment. You made a deliberate, calculated decision, the commander corrected him with surgical coldness. Step away from me instantly and summon your supervising commander to this exact coordinate. Execute that order now. For a fleeting second, it seemed the officer might attempt to argue, but the sheer, immovable gravitational presence of the military attorney crushed any lingering thought of resistance. Utterly defeated, the patrolman stumbled backward, unclipped the microphone attached to his uniform shoulder, and shakily broadcasted a request for his superior to respond to the scene. The subsequent 12 minutes stretched into an agonizing, silent purgatory. The commander remained perfectly statuesque before the camera, his hands securely bound. The patrolman paced frantically in the damp median grass, physically incapable of making eye contact with the man whose rights he had so thoroughly trampled. Eventually, a large utility vehicle bearing supervisor markings pulled onto the shoulder. A hardened veteran sergeant stepped out, immediately analyzing the bizarre tableau before him, his pale, hyperventilating subordinate pacing in the dirt, and a sharply dressed, utterly composed gentleman standing in steel restraints directly in the camera's field of view. What in the world is happening here? The sergeant barked, striding briskly toward the cruiser. Why is this individual secured? Before the panicking patrolman could even attempt to construct a lie, the commander interjected, Sergeant, his voice carried effortlessly over the hum of the distant traffic. I am the chief staff judge advocate for my command. Your subordinate initiated a purely pretextual traffic stop, unlawfully deprived me of my liberty without any reasonable or articulable suspicion, and proceeded to execute a warrantless search of my leased vehicle in direct, recorded violation of my explicit denial of consent. The veteran sergeant stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the commander, absorbing the immense weight of the military title and the flawless, indisputable legal terminology. He then slowly pivoted his head to glare at his subordinate. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from the younger officer's eyes confirmed that every single word the commander had spoken was absolute truth. The sergeant's voice dropped to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. Did you breach the interior of his vehicle? The patrolman opened his mouth to speak, but only managed a pathetic, barely visible nod. The sergeant closed his eyes tightly for a moment, instantly realizing that his department was about to be leveled by a massive, completely indefensible federal lawsuit. He immediately closed the distance to the commander, produced his own key, and swiftly unlocked the restraints. Sir, I offer my most profound and sincere apologies for this unacceptable conduct, the sergeant stated rapidly, stepping back. I assure you this type of behavior does not reflect the operational standards of this agency. The commander slowly brought his arms forward, gently rubbing the red indentations on his wrists. He did not raise his voice, nor did he offer any chaotic threats. He simply delivered the final procedural death blow. Verbal apologies do not rectify violations of the Constitution, Sergeant, the commander replied smoothly, his tone as cold as ice. I am formally instructing your agency to immediately preserve all dashboard and body-worn camera data regarding this interaction. I will be initiating contact with the district attorney and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice before the close of business today to file comprehensive formal grievances regarding the deprivation of my rights under the color of law. Without waiting for a response, the commander elegantly adjusted the collar of his navy shirt turned his back on the two men and walked calmly toward his pristine sedan. He never once looked back. He engaged the ignition, smoothly accelerated, and merged flawlessly back into the morning traffic, leaving the arrogant patrolman standing frozen on the side of the highway, fully comprehending that his unchecked biases had just permanently dismantled his career. Talk about choosing the absolute worst possible individual to target for a power trip. When arrogance meets real intellect, the results are always devastating. What are your thoughts on this encounter? Do you believe the officer's blatant disregard for constitutional boundaries warrants an immediate dismissal? Or is there room for rehabilitation in law enforcement after such a catastrophic violation of trust? Let me know how you would have handled the situation in the comments.